Speed. It is the eternal human obsession. For over a century, we have chased it, perfected it, and redefined what it means to move fast. This is the story of the fastest production car from every decade, from 1900 to today. If you enjoy this journey through automotive history, please like and subscribe. Now let us begin at the dawn of the 20th century, when the world first learned what it meant to go fast. At the turn of the 20th century, the automobile was not yet an automobile. It was a horseless carriage, a contraption, a mechanical curiosity that sputtered and coughed its way down dirt roads designed for animals. The world was still lit by gas lamps. The Wright brothers had not yet flown, and the idea that a machine could travel faster than a galloping horse was to most people either fantasy or folly. But in the south of France, along the sun-baked hills of Nice, a wealthy Austrian diplomat named Émile Jelinek was obsessed. Jelinek was not an engineer. He was a businessman, a dealer, and a dreamer. But he understood something that most men of his time did not. He understood that speed was not just a novelty, it was the future, and he was willing to bet his fortune on it. Jelinek had been purchasing cars from Daimler Motorengesellschaft, a German manufacturer run by Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach. But the cars they sold him were slow, heavy, and dangerous. The early Daimler vehicles had high centres of gravity. Their engines sat above the rear axle. When pushed to speed, they became unstable. Drivers lost control, some died. Jelinek himself had seen the carnage, and so in 1899 he approached Daimler with a demand. Build me a car that is fast but stable. Build me a car that will not kill me, and I will buy 36 of them. It was an audacious request, but Jelinek sweetened the deal. He told Daimler that he would sell these cars under a new name. Not Daimler, not his own name, but the name of his daughter, Mercedes. Wilhelm Maybach, the chief engineer, accepted the challenge. He began by lowering the chassis. He moved the engine forward, closer to the centre of the car. He lengthened the wheelbase to improve stability. He designed a new engine, a 4-cylinder, 35-horsepower unit that was lighter and more powerful than anything Daimler had built before. The engine used a honeycomb radiator to keep cool, a revolutionary design that allowed sustained high speeds without overheating. The car weighed just over 2,000 pounds. It had a top speed of 53 miles per hour. 53 miles per hour. Today, that sounds pedestrian. But in 1901, it was breathtaking. It was faster than any production car in the world. And when Jelinek debuted the Mercedes 35 HP at the Nice Speed Week in March of 1901, it dominated. It won race after race. Other cars broke down, overheated, or crashed. The Mercedes kept going. The press called it a miracle. Engineers called it the first modern car. The high-mounted engines of the 1890s were gone. The wobbly, carriage-like designs were obsolete. The Mercedes 35 HP established a template that would define the automobile for the next century. Low centre of gravity, front-mounted engine, long wheelbase, honeycomb radiator. These were not incremental improvements. They were a reinvention. But the story of the Mercedes is also the story of the world it was born into. In 1900, there were fewer than 8,000 cars in the United States. Roads were unpaved, gasoline was sold in pharmacies, tyres were made of solid rubber, and they wore out after a few hundred miles. Pneumatic tyres existed, but they punctured constantly. There were no gas stations, no repair shops, no speed limits, because no one imagined that speed limits would ever be necessary. Driving a car in 1900 was an act of adventure. You had to carry spare parts, tools, and extra fuel. You had to know how to repair your own engine, and if you wanted to go fast, you had to accept that the machine beneath you was barely understood, even by the men who built it. The Mercedes 35 HP changed that. It was reliable, it was fast, and it was beautiful. Its long, sleek body, its exposed engine, its leather seats, all of it spoke to a new kind of luxury. This was not a toy. This was a statement. Owning a Mercedes meant you were modern. You were forward-thinking. You were unafraid of the future. Émile Jelinek became one of the most successful car dealers in Europe. He sold hundreds of Mercedes vehicles to royalty, industrialists, and adventurers, and the name Mercedes, the name of his daughter, became synonymous with speed and elegance. But Jelinek was not content to simply sell cars. He raced them, he pushed them to their limits, and in doing so, he proved something essential. That speed was not just about horsepower, it was about engineering. It was about balance, control, and precision. The fastest car was not the one with the biggest engine. It was the one that could harness its power without falling apart. By the end of the decade, the Mercedes 35 HP had become a legend. It had set the standard for what a car could be. And it had proven that the future of transportation was not the horse. It was the internal combustion engine. But even as the Mercedes dominated the roads of Europe, engineers elsewhere were already dreaming of something faster. In America, Henry Ford was preparing to revolutionize manufacturing. In France, the Peugeot brothers were experimenting with lighter materials. And in Germany, a new generation of engineers was beginning to ask a simple question. If we can build a car that goes 50 miles per hour, why not 60? Why not 70? The race for speed had only just begun. The 1910s were the years when the automobile stopped being a curiosity and became a necessity. By 1910, there were nearly 500,000 cars on American roads. Henry Ford had introduced the Model T in 1908, and by the middle of the decade, he would perfect the assembly line, making cars affordable for the middle class. The world was changing fast. The Titanic would sink in 1912. The First World War would begin in 1914. And in the midst of all this upheaval, a small company in Trenton, New Jersey, would build one of the most iconic speed machines of the early century, the Mercer Raceabout. The Mercer Automobile Company was founded in 1909 by the Roebling family, the same family that had built the Brooklyn Bridge. They were engineers, industrialists, and risk-takers, and they understood that while Ford was selling cars to the masses, there was still a market for something else. Something raw, something dangerous, something built purely for speed. The Raceabout was introduced in 1911, and it was unlike anything else on the road. Most cars of the era were designed to look like carriages. They had high roofs, enclosed cabins, and soft suspensions meant for comfort. The Raceabout had none of that. It was stripped down to the essentials. No roof, no doors, no windshield, just a steering wheel, 2 bucket seats, a fuel tank, and an engine. It weighed just over 2,000 pounds, and it had a top speed of 75 miles per hour. 75 miles per hour in 1911 was not just fast, it was terrifying. The engine was a T-head inline 4-cylinder, displacing 300 cubic inches. It produced 58 horsepower, which does not sound like much today, but in a car this light, it was more than enough. The T-head design meant that the intake and exhaust valves were on opposite sides of the cylinder, operated by 2 separate camshafts. This was an older design, even by 1911 standards, but it was simple, reliable, and it made power. The Raceabout had no mechanical brakes on the front wheels. Only the rear wheels had brakes, operated by a hand lever. There was no shock absorption to speak of. The suspension was leaf springs, stiff and unforgiving. The tyres were narrow, high-pressure pneumatics that offered almost no grip by modern standards. And the steering was direct and heavy. At speed, the Raceabout demanded total focus. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and you could lose control. But that was the point. The Raceabout was not meant to be safe. It was meant to be thrilling. It was a car for sportsmen, for racers, for men who wanted to prove something to themselves and to the world. And it became a symbol of American automotive bravado. The man most associated with the Raceabout was Barney Oldfield, one of the most famous race car drivers of the era. Oldfield was a showman, a daredevil, and a legend. He had started his career racing bicycles, then moved to cars, and by the 1910s he was the face of American motorsport. He drove the Raceabout in exhibitions and races across the country, thrilling crowds with his fearless driving style. He would race against trains, against airplanes, against anything that moved, and he almost always won. Oldfield understood something essential about speed. It was not just about the car, it was about the spectacle. People did not come to see the machine, they came to see the man. And the Raceabout, with its exposed engine, its low-slung body, and its lack of any safety features, was the perfect vehicle for that kind of theatre. But the Raceabout was more than just a showpiece. It was a serious racing machine. In 1911 and 1912, it dominated American road races. It won at Santa Monica, it won at Elgin, it won at Brighton Beach. And it did so against much larger, more powerful cars. Because the Raceabout was not about brute force. It was about balance. It was about handling. It was about the driver. The design philosophy behind the Raceabout was simple. Remove everything that does not make the car faster. No excess weight, no unnecessary components, just power, lightness, and courage. This philosophy would be forgotten for decades, buried under layers of chrome and comfort. But it would return. In the 1950s with the Austin Healey, in the 1960s with the Lotus 7, And in the 2000s with the aerial Atom, the Raceabout was the spiritual ancestor of every stripped-down sports car that came after it. But the world around the Raceabout was changing. The First World War broke out in 1914, and suddenly, speed was not a luxury. It was a weapon. Automotive engineers were recruited to design engines for airplanes, for trucks, for tanks. The technology of war accelerated the technology of peace. By the end of the decade, engines were more powerful, materials were stronger, and the men who built cars had learned lessons on the battlefields of Europe that would reshape the industry. The Mercer Company struggled after the war. The Raceabout was expensive, impractical, and increasingly out of step with the times. Consumers wanted comfort, they wanted reliability, they wanted cars they could drive to work, not just to the racetrack. Production of the Raceabout ended in 1916. The company tried to reinvent itself with more conventional models, but it never recaptured the magic. By 1925, Mercer was gone. But the legend of the Raceabout endured. Decades later, collectors would hunt for surviving examples, paying fortunes for cars that were once sold for less than $3,000. Because the Raceabout represented something pure. It was speed without compromise. It was the last of the great brass-era speedsters. And as the 1910s came to a close, the world stood on the edge of a new era. The war had ended, the economy was booming, and a new generation of engineers was ready to push the boundaries of what a car could do. The 1920s would bring jazz, flappers, and prohibition. But they would also bring something else. They would bring the supercharger. The 1920s were the years when America learnt to roar. The war was over, the economy was exploding. Prohibition had turned drinking into an act of rebellion, and jazz music poured out of speakeasies in every major city. It was the age of excess, of optimism, of believing that tomorrow would always be better than today. And in the world of automobiles, no car embodied that spirit more completely than the Duesenberg Model J. Introduced in December of 1928, just months before the stock market crash that would end the party, the Duesenberg Model J was not just the fastest car of the decade. It was the most audacious. It was a machine built without compromise, without concern for cost and without apology. It was a car for movie stars, for gangsters, for royalty. And it could reach a top speed of 116 miles per hour. 116 miles per hour. In 1928, that was faster than most airplanes. The story of the Duesenberg begins with two brothers. Fred and August Duesenberg were immigrants from Germany who had settled in Iowa in the 1880s. They started as bicycle mechanics, then moved to building racing engines. By the 1910s, they were among the most respected engine builders in America. Their engines powered race cars to victory at Indianapolis. They built aircraft engines during the First World War. And by the 1920s, they had earned a reputation for engineering excellence that was unmatched. But Fred Duesenberg wanted more than respect. He wanted to build the greatest car in the world. And in 1926, he found the man who could make that dream a reality. His name was Erhard Loben Cord. Cord was a salesman, a hustler, and a visionary. He had taken over the struggling Auburn Automobile Company and turned it into a success. He understood marketing. He understood luxury, and he understood that in the 1920s, there was a class of wealthy Americans who wanted cars that were faster, more beautiful, and more exclusive than anything Europe could offer. Cord bought the Duesenberg Company and gave Fred Duesenberg a simple directive: build the best car in the world, spare no expense. Fred Duesenberg did exactly that. The heart of the Model J was its engine, a straight-8 dual overhead cam masterpiece that displaced 420 cubic inches. It produced 265 horsepower, more than double what most luxury cars of the era could manage. The engine had 4 valves per cylinder, a rarity in the 1920s. It had a pressurized lubrication system. It had aluminum pistons. It had a counterweighted crankshaft for smooth operation. And it was built to tolerances that were almost obsessive. Fred Duesenberg insisted that every engine be bench-tested for hours before installation. Any engine that did not meet his standards was torn down and rebuilt. The chassis was equally impressive. It rode on a wheelbase of 142.5 inches, longer than most cars on the road. The frame was made of deep-section chrome-nickel steel, incredibly strong and incredibly heavy. The suspension used semi-elliptic leaf springs, and the ride quality was smooth, even at high speeds. The brakes were hydraulic, operated by a vacuum booster, and they were enormous. 15-inch drums at all 4 corners. In an era when most cars still used mechanical brakes, this was cutting-edge technology. But the Duesenberg was not just about engineering. It was about presence. The Model J was sold as a rolling chassis. Customers would purchase the chassis and engine from Duesenberg, then take it to a coach builder to have a custom body built. The most famous coach builders of the era, names like Murphy, Durham, Ralston and LeBaron, all built bodies for the Model J, and each one was a work of art. Some were sleek speedsters with long hoods and no roofs. Some were opulent sedans with leather interiors and burl wood trim. Some were town cars with separate compartments for the driver and passengers. No two Duesenbergs were exactly alike. And that was the point. If you owned a Duesenberg, you owned something unique, something that announced to the world that you had arrived. The dashboard of the Model J was a marvel in itself. It had a central instrument panel with a speedometer that went up to 150 miles per hour. It had gauges for oil pressure, water temperature, fuel level, and battery charge. It had an altimeter, because why not? And it had warning lights for dozens of systems. The Duesenberg was one of the first cars to treat the driver as a pilot, someone who needed detailed information to operate the machine properly. The people who bought Duesenbergs were among the most famous and powerful in the world. Gary Cooper owned one, Clark Gable owned one, Greta Garbo owned one, Al Capone owned one, armoured and equipped with bulletproof glass. The King of Spain owned one. The Queen of Romania owned one. To say that someone drove a Duesenberg was to say that they had reached the absolute peak of success. But the Model J was more than just a status symbol. It was genuinely fast. Road tests from the era clocked it at 116 miles per hour in stock form. And in 1932, Duesenberg introduced the Model SJ, a supercharged version that produced 320 horsepower and could reach 140 miles per hour. The SJ was the fastest production car in the world, and it would hold that title for years. The supercharger on the SJ was a centrifugal unit mounted on the side of the engine, driven by the crankshaft. It compressed the intake air, forcing more fuel and oxygen into the cylinders. The result was a massive increase in power, but also a distinct mechanical whine that became the signature sound of the supercharged Duesenberg. When you heard that whine, you knew something extraordinary was approaching. But the 1920s were not just about luxury and excess. They were also about engineering progress. The decade saw the introduction of four-wheel brakes, hydraulic shock absorbers, synchronous transmissions, and safety glass. Cars were becoming more reliable, more comfortable, and more capable. The roads were improving too. The Federal Highway Act of 1921 had funded thousands of miles of paved roads across the country. For the first time, you could drive from New York to Los Angeles on pavement. And yet, the Duesenberg represented something else. It represented the idea that a car could be more than transportation. It could be art. It could be a statement of individuality. It could be a machine that stirred the soul. Fred Duesenberg did not live to see the full legacy of his creation. In 1932, he was driving in the mountains of Pennsylvania when he lost control of his car and crashed. He died from his injuries a few weeks later. He was 54 years old. The company continued for a few more years, but the Great Depression had destroyed the market for ultra-luxury cars. By 1937, Duesenberg was finished. But the cars survived, and today, a Duesenberg Model J is one of the most valuable automobiles in the world. They sell for millions of dollars. They are displayed in museums. They are driven at vintage rallies by people who understand that they are not just machines. They are rolling pieces of history. As the 1920s came to a close, the world was about to change again. The stock market had crashed. The Great Depression was beginning, and the era of unlimited optimism was over. But the pursuit of speed was not. In Europe, a new generation of engineers was preparing to push the boundaries even further. And in Germany, a company called Mercedes-Benz was about to build a car that would rewrite the rules entirely. The 1930s were the years when the world held its breath. The Great Depression had devastated economies across the globe. Unemployment was rampant, banks were failing. In America, bread lines stretched for blocks. In Europe, political extremism was rising. Fascism was spreading across Italy and Germany. The Spanish Civil War would erupt in 1936. The Second World War was coming, though most people did not want to believe it yet. But in the midst of all this uncertainty, there were still men who built cars for speed. And in Stuttgart, Germany, the engineers at Mercedes-Benz were about to create something extraordinary. The Mercedes-Benz 540K, introduced in 1936, was not just the fastest production car of the decade. It was a monument to engineering ambition. It was a car that could exceed 110 miles per hour in an era when most highways had speed limits of 45. It was a car that weighed over 5,000 pounds but moved with the grace of something far lighter. And it was a car that even today stands as one of the most beautiful machines ever built. The letter K stood for compressor, supercharger, and the supercharger was the defining feature of this car. Mercedes-Benz had been experimenting with forced induction since the 1920s. They understood that the easiest way to increase power was to force more air into the engine. A naturally aspirated engine can only draw in as much air as atmospheric pressure allows, but a supercharger compresses that air, packing more oxygen into the combustion chamber, allowing more fuel to burn, creating more power. The engine in the 540K was a straight 8, displacing 5.4 litres. Without the supercharger engaged, it produced 115 horsepower. But when the driver pressed the accelerator to the floor, a clutch engaged the Roots-type supercharger, and the engine roared to life with 180 horsepower. The sound was unmistakable, a rising mechanical scream that announced the arrival of something exceptional. The supercharger was not always engaged because it placed enormous stress on the engine. It was designed for short bursts of power, for overtaking, for acceleration, for moments when you needed everything the car could give. The rest of the time, the engine ran naturally aspirated, smooth and quiet, befitting a luxury car. But the 540K was not just about the engine, it was about the entire package. The chassis was enormous, with a wheelbase of 129 inches. The frame was made of oval section steel tubing, incredibly strong and surprisingly light for its size. The suspension used double wishbones in the front and a swing axle in the rear, both sprung by coil springs. This was advanced for the 1930s, when most cars still used leaf springs. The result was a ride that was both comfortable and controlled. The brakes were hydraulic, with large drums at all four wheels, and they needed to be large because stopping a £5,000 car travelling at over 100 miles per hour was no small task. The steering was worm and sector, precise but heavy at low speeds, lightening as the car gathered momentum. Like the Duesenberg before it, the 540K was sold as a chassis. Customers could choose from a variety of coach-built bodies. The most famous was the Special Roadster, designed by Hermann Ahrens at the Mercedes-Benz Sindelfingen works. It was a two-seater with a long, sweeping hood, flowing fenders, and exposed exhaust pipes that ran down the side of the car. The fenders were works of art in themselves, sculpted in compound curves that seemed to flow like liquid metal. The entire car sat low and wide, with a presence that was both elegant and aggressive. Other body styles included cabriolets, coupes, and formal sedans. But the Special Roadster was the one that captured imaginations. It was the one that appeared in advertisements, in films, in the dreams of anyone who loved cars, and it was astonishingly expensive. In 1936, a Special Roadster cost around 28,000 Reichsmarks, roughly the equivalent of $100,000 today. Only 32 were ever built. The people who bought the 540K were among the wealthiest and most powerful in the world: German industrialists, European aristocrats, film stars, and, inevitably, high-ranking members of the Nazi Party. This is the uncomfortable truth of the 540K. It was built in Hitler's Germany. It was a symbol of German engineering prowess at a time when that prowess was being turned toward war. Hermann Göring owned one. So did other Nazi leaders. And while the car itself was not political, it existed in a political context that cannot be ignored. But the 540K was also more than its context. It was a technical achievement. Mercedes-Benz engineers had solved problems that had plagued high-performance cars for decades. They had created an engine that was both powerful and reliable. They had designed a chassis that could handle that power without becoming unstable. They had built a car that was fast, beautiful, and usable. And they had done it at a time when most of the world was struggling just to survive. The 1930s were a decade of contradictions. On one hand, it was a time of incredible hardship. On the other hand, it was a time of remarkable innovation. Aviation was advancing rapidly. The Douglas DC-3 revolutionised air travel. The Hindenburg crossed the Atlantic. And on the ground, cars were becoming faster and more sophisticated. In America, the Auburn Speedster and the Cord 810 were pushing the boundaries of design and performance. In Italy, Alfa Romeo was building race cars that would dominate European circuits. In Britain, Jaguar was emerging as a serious performance brand. The world of high-performance automobiles was becoming international, competitive, and incredibly exciting. But the 540K stood apart. It was not just fast. It was a grand tourer in the truest sense. It was a car you could drive across Europe in comfort. then unleash on a mountain pass when the mood struck. It was civilized and wild at the same time. The technology developed for the 540K would influence Mercedes-Benz for decades. The supercharger technology would continue into the post-war era. The suspension design would inform future models. And the philosophy of building cars that combined luxury with performance would become a defining characteristic of the brand. But the 540K also marked the end of an era. By the late 1930s, Europe was preparing for war. Factories that built luxury cars would soon be building tanks and aircraft. Engineers who designed superchargers for road cars would design superchargers for fighter planes. The world of speed was about to be consumed by the world of conflict. Production of the 540K ended in 1939. The Second World War began that same year, and for the next 6 years, almost no one would build fast cars. The factories were turned over to war production. Gasoline was rationed, roads were empty, and the pursuit of speed, that quintessentially human obsession, was put on hold. But it would return. When the war ended, when the world began to rebuild, the dream of going fast would come back stronger than ever. And in the 1940s, in the ashes of a devastated world, a new generation would pick up where the old one had left off. The 1940s were the years when the world rebuilt itself from rubble. The Second World War had ended in 1945, leaving entire cities destroyed, economies shattered, and millions dead. Europe was a landscape of bombed-out factories and broken roads. In Britain, rationing continued long after the fighting stopped. Coal was scarce, steel was scarce, gasoline was scarce, everything was scarce. And yet, in a modest factory in Coventry, England, a small company called Jaguar was preparing to build one of the most important sports cars in history. The Jaguar XK120 was introduced at the London Motor Show in October of 1948, and it stunned the world. Here was a car that could reach 126 miles per hour, faster than almost anything else on the road. Here was a car with sleek, flowing bodywork that looked like it had been sculpted by the wind itself. And here was a car that cost less than half the price of its nearest competitor. The XK120 was not just fast, it was accessible. And that changed everything. The story of the XK120 begins with a man named William Lyons. Lyons had founded the company that would become Jaguar in 1922, building motorcycle sidecars in Blackpool. By the 1930s, he was building elegant sports cars under the name SS cars. But after the war, the name SS had become toxic, associated with the Nazi paramilitary organisation. So Lyons changed the name to Jaguar after one of his pre-war models and set about rebuilding his company. Britain in the late 1940s was desperate for export revenue. The government encouraged manufacturers to sell abroad, particularly to America, where there was money and a hunger for European sports cars. Lyons understood this. He knew that if he could build a car that was fast, beautiful, and affordable, he could sell it to Americans who wanted something more exciting than the heavy, softly sprung sedans coming out of Detroit. But first, he needed an engine. The XK engine, as it came to be known, was designed by William Haynes, Jaguar's chief engineer, along with Walter Hassan and Claude Bailey. It was a straight-six dual overhead cam design, displacing 3.4 litres. It produced 160 horsepower, an astonishing figure for a road car in 1948. The engine had an aluminum cylinder head with hemispherical combustion chambers, which allowed for better airflow and more efficient burning of fuel. It had twin SU carburetors. It had a 7-bearing crankshaft for smooth operation, and it was designed to be both powerful and reliable. Haynes and his team had actually designed the XK engine before the war, intending it for a luxury sedan. But when Lyons decided to build a sports car, the engine found its true calling. It was originally meant to be a temporary power plant, something to use until a more advanced engine could be developed. But the XK engine was so good, so durable, so tunable, that Jaguar would continue using variations of it for the next 40 years. The chassis of the XK120 was relatively conventional. It used a steel box section frame with independent front suspension using torsion bars, and a live rear axle with semi-elliptic leaf springs. The brakes were drums all around, operated by a hydraulic system. The steering was recirculating ball, quick and responsive. Nothing about the chassis was revolutionary, but everything was well executed, and that was enough. But it was the body that made people stop and stare. The XK120 was available in two forms: the Roadster, which was open-topped with a removable soft top, and the fixed-head coupe, which had a graceful fastback roofline. Both were breathtakingly beautiful. The bodywork was aluminum, hand-formed over wooden frames, a traditional British method that allowed for complex curves and shapes. The front end was dominated by a wide, oval grille, flanked by covered headlights that gave the car a streamlined appearance. The fenders flowed into the doors without interruption. The rear haunches were wide and muscular, and the overall effect was one of motion, even when the car was standing still. The interior was simple but well appointed. Leather seats, a wood-rimmed steering wheel, a dashboard with clear, easy-to-read gauges. Everything was functional, nothing was excessive. This was a driver's car, not a show car, though it was certainly beautiful enough to be both. When the XK120 debuted in 1948, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Journalists praised its speed, its handling, its beauty. Customers lined up to buy one. And Jaguar, which had intended the XK120 to be a low-volume model, built mainly to showcase the new engine, suddenly found itself with a hit on its hands. In 1949, a nearly stock XK120, driven by Leslie Johnson and Peter Walker, competed in the 24 Hours of Spa, one of Europe's most demanding endurance races. It finished first in class and fifth overall, beating cars with much larger engines. This was proof that the XK120 was not just a pretty face, it was a genuine performance machine. The following year, Jaguar entered 3 modified XK120s at Le Mans, the most prestigious endurance race in the world. They did not win, but they finished well, and they proved that Jaguar was serious about racing. Within a few years, Jaguar would win Le Mans outright, multiple times, with race cars derived from the XK120. The C-Type, the D-Type, legends of motorsport, all trace their lineage back to this car. But the XK120's greatest impact was in America. American servicemen stationed in Britain during the war had seen European sports cars and fallen in love with them. When they returned home, they wanted cars that were nimble, fast and fun, not the lumbering cruisers that Detroit was building. The XK120 arrived at exactly the right moment. It was expensive by British standards, but cheap by American ones, and it was faster than almost anything you could buy. Sports car clubs began forming across America. Road racing became popular, and the XK120 became a common sight at these events, driven by enthusiasts who appreciated its combination of speed, beauty, and value. It helped create a market for imported sports cars in America, a market that would grow throughout the 1950s and 60s. The 1940s were not an easy time to build cars. Materials were rationed, factories were damaged, skilled workers were in short supply. But Jaguar persevered. William Lyons was a perfectionist, obsessed with getting every detail right. He would spend hours studying the curves of the body, adjusting them by fractions of an inch until they were exactly as he wanted. He believed that beauty was not just about aesthetics. It was about proportion, balance, harmony. And the XK120 embodied all of those qualities. By the time production ended in 1954, Jaguar had built over 12,000 XK120s. It had established the company as a major player in the sports car world, and it had proven that Britain, despite its post-war struggles, could still build world-class automobiles. But the XK120 also represented something larger. It represented hope. After 6 years of war, after rationing and destruction and loss, here was something beautiful. Here was something that existed purely to bring joy. You did not need an XK120. It was not practical, it was not economical, but it was thrilling. And in a world that had seen so much darkness, that thrill mattered. The technology developed for the XK120 would influence Jaguar for decades. The XK engine would power everything from the Mark 7 sedan to the legendary E-Type. The design language would evolve, but never completely disappear. And the philosophy of building cars that combined performance with elegance would become Jaguar's calling card. As the 1940s came to a close, the world was beginning to recover. The Marshall Plan was rebuilding Europe, the economy was growing, and the automobile industry was entering a new golden age. In America, fins and chrome were about to dominate. In Europe, small, efficient cars were becoming popular. And in the world of high performance, the race for speed was accelerating. The 1950s would bring new technologies, new competitors, and new definitions of what fast meant. And they would bring one car that would change motorsport forever. The 1950s were the years when the world learnt to dream again. The war was a fading memory. The economy was booming. In America, suburbs were sprawling across the landscape. Television sets appeared in living rooms. Rock and roll was born. In Europe, cities were being rebuilt. highways were being paved, and the automobile was no longer a luxury. It was becoming a part of everyday life. But for those who wanted more than everyday, for those who wanted something extraordinary, there was the Mercedes-Benz 300 SL. Introduced in February of 1954 at the New York International Auto Show, the 300 SL was unlike anything the world had seen. It had doors that opened upward, like the wings of a seagull. It had a fuel-injected engine that could propel it to 160 miles per hour. And it had a race-bred pedigree that made it more than just a fast car. It was a racing car for the road. The letters SL stood for Sport-Light, and lightness was at the core of the 300 SL's design philosophy. The story begins in 1952 when Mercedes-Benz decided to return to motorsport. The company had dominated racing in the 1930s, but the war had ended all of that. Now, 7 years after the war's end, Mercedes was ready to prove itself again. They built a race car based on the running gear of the 300 sedan, but with a lightweight tubular space frame chassis that was both incredibly strong and remarkably light. The space frame was revolutionary. Instead of a traditional ladder frame with body panels attached to it, the space frame used dozens of small diameter steel tubes welded together in a three-dimensional structure. The tubes formed triangles, the strongest geometric shape, and the entire structure distributed loads evenly throughout the chassis. It was inspired by aircraft design, and it was brilliant. But the space frame created a problem. The tubes ran high along the sides of the car where the doors would normally be. Conventional doors that hinged at the front would require cutting through the frame, weakening it. So the engineers designed doors that hinged at the roof. Gullwing doors. They were not the first car to use this design, but they would become the most famous. The race car, also called the 300 SL, debuted at the Mille Miglia in May of 1952. It finished second overall. A month later, it won the 24 Hours of Le Mans. In August, it won the Carrera Panamericana, the brutal Mexican road race. Mercedes-Benz had returned to racing, and they had done it in spectacular fashion. But Max Hoffmann, an Austrian-born car importer based in New York, saw something more. Hoffmann was the man who had convinced Porsche to build the Speedster. He had convinced BMW to build smaller, sportier cars. And now he convinced Mercedes-Benz to build a road-going version of the 300 SL. He promised to buy 1,000 of them if they would build it. Mercedes agreed. But turning a race car into a production car was not simple. The racing 300 SL had a stripped-out interior, no sound insulation, and a rough ride. It was loud, uncomfortable, and temperamental. The production version needed to be refined, civilized, usable. But it also needed to retain the performance that made the race car special. The engine was a 3-litre inline-six, based on the unit from the 300 sedan, but extensively modified. The most significant change was the addition of direct fuel injection developed by Bosch. This was the first production car to use fuel injection, and it was a game-changer. Fuel injection allowed for precise control of the fuel mixture. Carburetors, which were standard on every other car of the era, relied on air pressure differences to draw fuel into the engine. They were simple and reliable, but they were also imprecise. At high altitudes, they ran rich. In cold weather, they ran lean. And they could not deliver fuel as efficiently as injection. The Bosch system used a mechanical pump to inject fuel directly into the intake ports at high pressure. The amount of fuel was controlled by a complex mechanical computer that took into account engine speed, throttle position, and manifold pressure. The result was more power, better fuel economy, and smoother operation across all conditions. With fuel injection, the 3-litre engine produced 215 horsepower in European specification, or 175 in the lower compression American version. That was enough to push the car to a top speed of 160 miles per hour in European trim, making it the fastest production car in the world. The chassis retained the tubular space frame from the race car, but the suspension was softened for road use. The front used double wishbones with coil springs. The rear used a swing axle with coil springs, a design that was common on Mercedes-Benz cars of the era, but had a significant drawback. Under hard cornering, the rear wheels would tuck under, reducing the contact patch and causing sudden oversteer. Skilled drivers could manage it, but it demanded respect. The body was aluminum, hand-formed over the space frame. The design was the work of Friedrich Geiger, and it was stunning. The long hood, the rounded fenders, the distinctive eyebrows over the wheel arches, all of it combined to create a shape that was both functional and beautiful. And of course, there were the gullwing doors, dramatic and unforgettable. Inside, the 300 SL was surprisingly luxurious. Leather seats, a wood-rimmed steering wheel, a dashboard covered in leather with chrome-rimmed gauges. Large windows provided excellent visibility. And despite the race car origins, the interior was quiet and comfortable, at least by the standards of the day. But getting in and out was an adventure. The door sills, formed by the space frame tubes, were high and wide. You had to step over them carefully. And if you parked too close to a wall or another car, you could not open the doors at all. The Gullwing design was dramatic, but it was also impractical. When the 300 SL went on sale in 1954, it cost nearly $11,000, more than twice the price of a Chevrolet Corvette. But it was worth it. This was not just a car, it was a statement. Owning a 300 SL meant you had arrived. You were sophisticated, successful, worldly, and you appreciated engineering excellence. The people who bought 300 SLs were a fascinating mix. There were European aristocrats and American industrialists. There were film stars like Clark Gable and Sophia Loren. There were racing drivers who used them as daily drivers. And there were a surprising number of women. The 300 SL was one of the first high-performance cars that women bought in significant numbers, partly because it was easier to drive than many sports cars of the era, thanks to its smooth engine and precise fuel injection. In motorsport, the 300 SL continued to shine. Privateer racers campaigned them in rallies and road races across Europe and America. They won their class at events like the Liège-Rome-Liège rally. They set speed records, and they proved that a production car could be competitive in serious competition. But the Gullwing version had its limitations. The high door sills made entry and exit difficult. The swing axle suspension could be treacherous in the wet, and some customers wanted a convertible, something they could drive with the top down on a sunny day. So in 1957, Mercedes-Benz introduced the 300 SL Roadster. It had conventional doors, a lower door sill, and a slightly revised suspension that improved handling. The Gullwing was discontinued. Production of the Roadster continued until 1963, and it sold in much higher numbers than the Gullwing. But it is the Gullwing that captured imaginations. It is the Gullwing that became an icon. And it is the Gullwing that today is one of the most valuable and sought-after collector cars in the world. A pristine example can sell for over $1 million. Some special models have sold for much more. The 300 SL represented a turning point in automotive history. It proved that advanced technology, like fuel injection and space frame construction, could work in a production car. It proved that there was a market for expensive, high-performance sports cars. And it proved that beauty and engineering could coexist in perfect harmony. The 1950s were a time of optimism and progress. The interstate highway system was being built in America. Jet airliners were beginning to replace propeller planes. And the automobile industry was entering a golden age of design and performance. In Detroit, cars were getting bigger, faster, and more powerful. In Europe, sports cars were becoming more sophisticated, and the race for speed was accelerating. As the decade came to a close, a new generation of engineers was preparing to push even further. Engines were getting smaller but more powerful, materials were getting lighter, and the dream of building a car that could exceed 200 miles per hour was no longer a fantasy. It was becoming a reality. The 1960s would bring that reality to life. The 1960s were the years when everything changed. It was the decade of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, of the moon landing and the Vietnam War, of civil rights marches and counterculture revolutions. The old rules were being questioned. The old boundaries were being broken. And in the world of automobiles, a small tractor manufacturer from northern Italy was about to shatter every convention about what a sports car should be. The Lamborghini Miura, introduced at the Geneva Motor Show in March of 1966, was not just the fastest production car of the decade. It was a complete reimagining of the supercar. It had a mid-mounted V12 engine positioned transversely behind the driver. It had styling so dramatic that it looked like it had arrived from the future. And it had a top speed of 170 miles per hour, faster than anything else you could buy and drive on the street. The story of the Miura begins with a man named Ferruccio Lamborghini. Lamborghini was a wealthy industrialist who had made his fortune building tractors in the years after the Second World War. He was a car enthusiast who owned Ferraris, Maseratis, and Mercedes-Benzes. But he was dissatisfied with them. He thought they were too fragile, too temperamental, too poorly built. And when he complained to Enzo Ferrari about a clutch problem in his Ferrari 250 GT, Ferrari dismissed him, told him to stick to building tractors. That dismissal was a mistake, because Ferruccio Lamborghini decided that if no one would build the perfect grand touring car for him, he would build it himself. In 1963, Lamborghini hired a young engineer named Giotto Bizzarini, who had worked at Ferrari and designed the legendary 250 GTO. Bizzarini designed a V12 engine, a 3.5-litre masterpiece with dual overhead cams per bank, 6 Weber carburetors, and an output of over 350 horsepower. It was smooth, powerful, and sophisticated, and it became the foundation of every Lamborghini that followed. The first Lamborghini, the 350 GT, debuted in 1964. It was a front-engined Grand Tourer, elegant and fast, but conventional in its layout. It competed directly with Ferrari, and it was good. But it was not revolutionary. The revolution came from 3 young engineers in Lamborghini's employ: Gianpaolo Dallara, Paolo Stanzani, and Bob Wallace. They were all in their 20s, they were all passionate about racing, and they all believed that the future of high-performance cars was the mid-engine layout. The mid-engine concept was not new. Racing cars had been using it for years. By placing the engine behind the driver but ahead of the rear axle, you centralised the mass of the car. This improved weight distribution, reduced polar moment of inertia, and made the car more agile, more responsive, more balanced. Every serious race car of the 1960s used a mid-engine layout, but no one had put a mid-mounted engine in a production road car. Dallara, Stanzani, and Wallace decided to try. They worked on the project in secret, during evenings and weekends, without Ferruccio Lamborghini's knowledge. They took the V12 engine from the 350 GT and mounted it transversely, sideways, behind the driver. This was a radical decision. Most mid-engine race cars mounted the engine longitudinally, in line with the car. But a transverse layout saved space, allowing for a shorter wheelbase and a more compact design. They designed a monocoque chassis, a single shell of welded steel that provided both structure and support. This was lighter and stiffer than a traditional frame. They used double wishbone suspension at all 4 corners, and they added disc brakes all around, a necessity for a car this fast. When Ferruccio Lamborghini saw the rolling chassis, he was sceptical. A mid-engine road car seemed impractical, uncomfortable, loud, but he agreed to show it at the Turin Auto Show in November of 1965. It appeared as a bare chassis, no body, just the mechanical components, and it caused a sensation. Engineers and journalists gathered around it, marvelling at the compact V12, the sophisticated suspension, the innovative layout. Orders started coming in immediately. People wanted to buy a car that did not even have a body yet. Lamborghini realised he had no choice. He had to build it. For the body, Lamborghini turned to Marcello Gandini, a young designer at Bertone. Gandini was just 27 years old, but he had a vision. He wanted to create something that looked like it was moving even when it was standing still. Something low, wide, aggressive. Something that would make people stop and stare. The body Gandini designed for the Miura was a masterpiece. It was just 41 inches tall, lower than almost any car on the road. The front end was dominated by pop-up headlights that sat flush with the hood when not in use. The hood itself was a clamshell design that opened from the front, revealing the spare tyre, fuel tank and radiator. The roofline was a smooth curve that flowed back to a distinctive rear deck, with horizontal slats that allowed air to escape from the engine bay. The rear haunches were wide and muscular, housing the massive rear tyres. And around the headlights and taillights, Gandini added what would become his signature touch. Eyelashes, sculpted lines that gave the car a sensual, almost feline appearance. The interior was surprisingly comfortable. Leather seats, air conditioning, a wood-rimmed steering wheel, large windows that provided good visibility despite the low roofline. But the driving position was offset to one side because of the transverse engine. And the engine was right behind your head, separated only by a thin firewall. When you started the Miura, the roar was deafening. When you accelerated, it was symphonic. The Miura debuted in final production form at the Geneva Motor Show in March of 1966, and the reaction was overwhelming. Journalists called it the most beautiful car ever made. Customers lined up to buy one, and Ferrari, Lamborghini's rival, suddenly looked old-fashioned. Their front-engine cars seemed like relics of a previous era. But the Miura was not without problems. The transverse engine layout, while compact, created issues. The gearbox was integrated into the engine's sump, sharing the same oil. This meant the transmission oil got hot, very hot, and gears would sometimes pop out under hard acceleration. The front end was light, because most of the weight was over the rear wheels. At high speeds, the nose would lift, reducing steering feel and stability. And the cooling system struggled to keep the engine at a reasonable temperature, especially in traffic. Lamborghini addressed these issues over the years. The Miura S, introduced in 1968, had more power, 370 horsepower, and improved rigidity. The Miura SV, introduced in 1971, had even more power, 385 horsepower, a stiffer chassis, and wider rear fenders to accommodate larger tyres. The SV also featured separate lubrication systems for the engine and gearbox, solving one of the original car's biggest flaws. But even with its quirks, the Miura was transcendent. It was a car that made you feel alive. The steering was heavy at low speeds, but came alive as you accelerated. The engine delivered power in a smooth linear rush, with no turbo lag, no sudden surges, just relentless acceleration accompanied by the sound of 12 cylinders screaming behind your head. And the handling, once you learned to respect it, was extraordinary. The mid-engine layout gave the car a balance and agility that front-engined cars simply could not match. The Miura changed the supercar forever. Before it, exotic cars were front-engined Grand Tourers, fast in a straight line but not particularly agile. After it, every serious supercar went mid-engine. The Ferrari Dino, the Maserati Bora, the De Tomaso Pantera, and eventually Ferrari's own Berlinetta Boxer and Testarossa. All of them owed a debt to the Miura. The people who bought Miuras were a select group: film stars, rock musicians, racing drivers. Frank Sinatra owned one, Miles Davis owned one, Rod Stewart owned one, and they drove them hard. The Miura was not a garage queen. It was meant to be driven, and driven fast. In total, Lamborghini built just 764 Miuras between 1966 and 1973. By the standards of mass production, that is nothing. But each one was special, each one was hand-built, and each one carried with it the spirit of rebellion that defined the 1960s. The Miura represented more than just speed. It represented a rejection of convention. It represented the idea that young engineers, working late into the night, could create something that would change the world. It represented the belief that beauty and performance were not opposites but partners. The 1960s were a time of upheaval and innovation. The world was changing faster than ever before, and the automobile industry was changing with it. Safety regulations were being introduced. Emissions standards were on the horizon. The muscle car era was reaching its peak in America, and in Europe, the supercar was being born. As the decade came to a close, the golden age of unrestricted performance was ending. The 1970s would bring new challenges, new regulations, new realities. But they would also bring new innovations. And the pursuit of speed, that fundamental human drive, would continue. It would just have to be smarter. The 1970s were the years when the party ended. The optimism of the 60s gave way to uncertainty and crisis. The Vietnam War dragged on. Watergate destroyed faith in government. The oil embargo of 1973 sent fuel prices soaring and created gas lines that stretched for blocks. Inflation spiraled out of control. And in the automotive world, new regulations strangled performance. Emissions controls, safety bumpers, and fuel economy standards transformed cars from objects of desire into appliances of compliance. But just before the decade began, in 1968, Ferrari built one last monument to the age of unrestricted speed. The 365 GTB/4, known universally as the Daytona, was a defiant statement. It was a front-engined V12 Grand Tourer that could exceed 174 miles per hour, making it the fastest production car in the world when it was introduced. And it represented the end of an era, the final expression of a philosophy that would soon be regulated out of existence. The name Daytona was never official. Ferrari called it the 365 GTB/4, indicating a 3.6-litre engine, Gran Turismo Berlinetta body, and 4 camshafts. But everyone called it the Daytona, after Ferrari's stunning 1-2-3 finish at the 24 Hours of Daytona in February of 1967. The name stuck, even though Ferrari never formally adopted it. The Daytona was designed as a response to the Lamborghini Miura. When the Miura debuted in 1966 with its mid-mounted engine and radical styling, it threatened to make Ferrari look obsolete. Enzo Ferrari had always believed in the front-engine layout for road cars. He thought mid-engine cars were too difficult to drive, too unforgiving, suitable only for racetracks. But the Miura's success forced him to respond. His response was the Daytona, and it was magnificent. The engine was a 4.4-litre V12, designed by Gioacchino Colombo and refined over decades. It had dual overhead camshafts on each bank, 6 Weber carburetors, and a compression ratio of 9.3 to 1. It produced 352 horsepower at 7,500 revolutions per minute. The red line was 7,700, and the engine was placed as far back in the chassis as possible, just behind the front axle line to improve weight distribution. This front-mid engine layout, as it came to be called, gave the Daytona exceptional balance. 52% of the weight was on the rear wheels, 48% on the front. This made the car neutral in handling, predictable, controllable. It did not have the knife-edge nervousness of the Miura. It was a car you could drive hard without fear. The chassis was a steel tube frame with aluminum body panels. The suspension used double wishbones at all 4 corners, with coil springs and telescopic shock absorbers. The brakes were ventilated discs, large and powerful, necessary for stopping a car that weighed 3,500 pounds and could reach 170 miles per hour. The body was designed by Leonardo Fioravanti at Pininfarina, and it was controversial. Pininfarina had been designing beautiful, curvaceous Ferraris for years. But Fioravanti took a different approach with the Daytona. He created something angular, aggressive, modernist. The front end was dominated by a wide, flat nose with pop-up headlights hidden behind a clear acrylic panel. The roofline was low and fastback, flowing smoothly to a camtail, a squared-off rear end that reduced drag. The fenders were sculpted with sharp creases, and the overall effect was purposeful, muscular, unapologetically masculine. Some people loved it, some people hated it, but no one could ignore it. The interior was pure Ferrari, leather everywhere, a gated shifter for the 5-speed manual transmission, a wood-rimmed steering wheel, analog gauges with a large tachometer directly in front of the driver, because in a Ferrari, engine speed mattered more than road speed. The driving position was low, the pedals offset slightly to the right, and the engine, that glorious V12, sat just on the other side of the firewall, filling the cabin with mechanical music. Driving the Daytona was an experience unlike anything else. The engine was tractable at low speeds, smooth and refined. But as the revs climbed, it transformed. The sound changed from a burble to a howl. The acceleration became ferocious. And when you reached the upper ranges of the rev band, when the tachometer needle swung past 6,000, past 7,000, the Daytona became something transcendent. It was not just fast. It was violent in its speed, addictive in its intensity. The Daytona competed directly with the Miura, and comparisons were inevitable. The Miura was more exotic, more visually dramatic, more radical in its engineering. But the Daytona was faster in a straight line, more stable at high speed, and easier to live with day to day. The Miura was a car for making an entrance. The Daytona was a car for crossing continents at speed. Road tests of the era confirmed the Daytona's performance. Road and Track magazine tested one in 1971 and recorded a top speed of 174 miles per hour. 0 to 60 miles per hour took 5.4 seconds. The standing quarter mile took 13.8 seconds. These were astonishing numbers for the early 70s, numbers that would not be matched by a production car for years. But even as the Daytona was setting speed records, the world was changing around it. In 1970, the United States introduced stringent emissions regulations. Cars sold in America had to be equipped with catalytic converters, air pumps, and other pollution control devices. These devices reduced power and increased weight. The Daytona sold in America was detuned to meet these regulations, producing just 251 horsepower instead of 352. It was still fast, but it was no longer the monster it had been. The oil crisis of 1973 made things worse. When OPEC imposed an oil embargo in response to American support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War, fuel prices quadrupled. Gas stations ran dry. Governments imposed speed limits to conserve fuel. In America, the national speed limit was reduced to 55 miles per hour. Suddenly, a car that could exceed 170 miles per hour seemed absurd, irresponsible, a relic of a more innocent time. Ferrari's sales plummeted. The company struggled financially. And the Daytona, which had been in production since 1968, was discontinued in 1973. Only 1,406 were built, split between coupes and convertible spiders. It was replaced by the Berlinetta Boxer Ferrari's first mid-engine 12-cylinder road car, an admission that Lamborghini had been right all along. But the Daytona's legacy endured. It became a symbol of a lost era, the last of the great front-engine V12 Ferraris, the final car built before regulations and reality intruded. And in the years that followed, its reputation only grew. In 1984, the Daytona experienced a curious cultural resurgence when it appeared in the television show Miami Vice. Except it was not a real Daytona. It was a fiberglass replica built on a Corvette chassis. Ferrari was not amused. They sued and the replica was destroyed on camera, replaced with real Testarossas for later seasons. But the fake Daytona had introduced the car to a new generation, and suddenly, people wanted the real thing. Values began to climb. In the 1980s, you could buy a Daytona for $30,000 or $40,000. By the 2000s, they were selling for hundreds of thousands. Today, a pristine example can fetch over $1 million. The convertible Spiders, rarer and more desirable, sell for even more. The 1970s were not kind to performance cars. Muscle cars disappeared. Supercar production slowed. Engineers focused on meeting regulations rather than building speed. But amidst all the compromise and retreat, the Daytona stood as a reminder of what had been possible. It was a car built without apology, without compromise, without concern for anything except speed and beauty. The world that created the Daytona was gone. But the car remained, and it reminded everyone who saw it that speed was not just about numbers. It was about passion, about craftsmanship, about the belief that some things should exist simply because they can. As the 1970s continued, the automotive world struggled to adapt. Turbochargers emerged as a way to restore lost performance. Electronic fuel injection replaced carburetors, and engineers began to realize that the future of speed would not come from larger engines and more cylinders. It would come from efficiency, from technology, from doing more with less. The 1980s would prove that theory correct. The 1980s were the years when excess returned with a vengeance. The oil crisis was over. The economy was roaring. Cocaine and champagne flowed through Wall Street trading floors. Madonna and Michael Jackson dominated the radio, and in the world of automobiles, technology was advancing faster than ever before. Turbochargers, electronic fuel injection, composite materials, all of it was transforming what cars could do. The malaise of the 70s was over, speed was back, and it was faster than ever. In 1987, Ferrari unveiled a car that would define the decade and become one of the most iconic supercars ever built, the F40. It was raw, purposeful, and utterly uncompromising. It had a twin turbocharged V8 engine, producing 478 horsepower. It weighed just 2,500 pounds, and it could reach a top speed of 201 miles per hour, making it the first production car to break the 200-mile-per-hour barrier. The F40 was not meant to be comfortable. It was not meant to be refined. It was meant to be the fastest, most extreme road car Ferrari had ever built. And it was created for one reason: to celebrate Ferrari's 40th anniversary. Enzo Ferrari was 89 years old in 1987. He had spent his entire adult life building race cars and road cars. He had seen his company rise, struggle, nearly collapse, and rise again. And he wanted one final statement, one last car that would remind the world what Ferrari stood for: speed, performance, racing purity. He gave the project to his engineers with a simple directive: build me a car that is as close to a race car as possible, but still legal for the road. Strip away everything unnecessary. Make it light, make it fast, make it a Ferrari. The chief engineer was Nicola Materazzi, who had previously worked on Ferrari's Formula One program and the 288 GTO race car. Materazzi understood that the key to speed was not just power, it was the power-to-weight ratio. A car with 500 horsepower that weighed 5,000 pounds would be slower than a car with 400 horsepower that weighed 2,000 pounds. So he set about making the F40 as light as possible. The chassis was a steel tube frame, but everything else was composite. The body panels were carbon fibre and Kevlar. The hood, the doors, the rear deck, all of it was lightweight composite material. There was no sound insulation, no carpets, no leather. The seats were thin racing buckets covered in cloth. The door handles were simple cables. The windows were made of plastic instead of glass. Even the fuel tank was a lightweight racing bladder. The result was a car that weighed just 2,525 pounds. For comparison, a contemporary Porsche 911 weighed over 3,000 pounds. The F40 was lighter than most modern sports cars, despite having a much larger engine. That engine was a 2.9-litre V8 with dual overhead cams per bank and 4 valves per cylinder. But the real key to its performance was the twin turbochargers, one for each bank of cylinders. Turbocharging had become common in the 1980s as a way to extract more power from smaller engines while still meeting emissions regulations. But Ferrari's implementation was aggressive. The turbos were IHI units, running relatively high boost pressure. When the engine was at full throttle above 4,000 revolutions per minute, the turbos spooled up and transformed the car. Below that threshold, the F40 felt quick but manageable. Above it, it became ferocious. The power delivery was not linear. It arrived in a sudden, explosive rush that pinned you back in your seat and demanded total concentration. There was no traction control, no anti-lock brakes, no stability control. Just you, the engine, and your ability to control it. The transmission was a 5-speed manual with a traditional gated shifter. The clutch was heavy, the shifter required deliberate movement, and the whole experience was physical, demanding. This was not a car you could drive casually. It required your full attention. The suspension was double wishbones at all 4 corners, with coil springs and adjustable dampers. The ride was firm, almost harsh, because the F40 was designed for the track first and the road second. The steering was unassisted, heavy at low speeds, but coming alive as velocity increased. And the brakes were massive ventilated discs with no power assist, requiring real pressure to slow the car from high speeds. The body design was the work of Pininfarina, but it was pure function over form. Every surface, every vent, every wing had a purpose. The front end was low and wide with a massive splitter to generate downforce. The sides had large air intakes to feed the turbochargers and cool the brakes. The rear featured a huge wing that provided stability at high speeds. And the overall shape was aggressive, angular, purposeful. This was not a pretty car in the traditional sense. It was beautiful in the way a fighter jet is beautiful. The F40 debuted at the Civic Centre in Maranello on July 21, 1987. Enzo Ferrari himself attended, one of his last public appearances. He was frail, confined to a wheelchair, but his eyes were sharp. When he saw the F40, he smiled. This was his final masterpiece, his last gift to the world of speed. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Journalists called it the greatest Ferrari ever built. Customers scrambled to place orders. Ferrari had planned to build only 400, but demand was so strong that production continued until 1992, with a total of 1,311 built. But the F40 was not without controversy. The original plan was to sell it only to loyal Ferrari customers, people who had owned multiple Ferraris and would actually drive the car. But speculators got involved. People who had no interest in driving bought F40s as investments, hoping to flip them for profit. The list price was around $400,000, but speculators were selling them for over $1 million before they had even taken delivery. Enzo Ferrari despised this. He wanted his cars driven, not locked away in climate-controlled garages. And when they were driven, the F40 was extraordinary. Road tests confirmed the performance claims. Car and Driver magazine recorded a top speed of 197 miles per hour, just shy of 200. 0 to 60 miles per hour took 3.8 seconds. The standing quarter mile took 11.8 seconds at 128 miles per hour. These were numbers that put the F40 ahead of everything else, including the Porsche 959 and the Lamborghini Countach. But the experience of driving it was more important than the numbers. The F40 was loud. The turbocharged V8 produced a sound that was part scream, part industrial roar. The ride was harsh. Every imperfection in the road transmitted directly through the chassis. The heat from the engine made the cabin sweltering. And the turbo lag meant you had to plan your acceleration, waiting for the boost to arrive, then hanging on as the car lunged forward. It was not easy, it was not comfortable, but it was thrilling in a way that few cars have ever been. The F40 represented the peak of analog supercar design. It was the last great Ferrari built, before electronics took over, before traction control and anti-lock brakes became standard, before cars became easier to drive but less engaging. It was a car that demanded skill, courage, and commitment, and it rewarded those qualities with an experience that was pure, unfiltered, unforgettable. Enzo Ferrari died on August 14th, 1988, just over a year after the F40's debut. He was 90 years old. He had lived long enough to see his final car become a legend, and the F40 became his epitaph, a reminder of what he had believed in. That racing improved the breed, that performance mattered more than comfort, that a car should make you feel alive. The 1980s were a transformative decade for the automobile industry. Japanese manufacturers emerged as serious competitors, building cars that were reliable, efficient, and increasingly fast. The Porsche 959 proved that a street-legal race car could be civilized enough for everyday use. The Audi Quattro showed that all-wheel drive could transform performance, and computers were beginning to invade every aspect of car design, from fuel injection to suspension control. But amidst all this technological progress, the F40 stood as a reminder that speed was not just about numbers and computers. It was about emotion. It was about the connection between man and machine. It was about building something that scared you just a little bit every time you drove it. As the decade came to a close, the world was changing again. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Cold War was ending, the internet was beginning to emerge, and the automotive industry was preparing for a new era of even greater speed, even more advanced technology. The 1990s would bring cars that could exceed 200 miles per hour with ease, cars that used computers to make them faster and safer. But none of them would ever quite recapture the raw, unfiltered intensity of the F40. The 1990s were the years when the world went digital. The internet transformed communication. Mobile phones became commonplace. The Soviet Union collapsed, ending the Cold War and redrawing the map of Europe. The global economy boomed, creating unprecedented wealth. And in the automotive world, technology reached a level of sophistication that would have seemed like science fiction just a decade earlier. Electronic fuel injection was universal. Anti-lock brakes were standard. Traction control systems kept cars stable. And engineers began to ask a question that had seemed impossible just years before. Could we build a car that exceeds 240 miles per hour? The answer came from an unlikely source. Not from Ferrari or Lamborghini or Porsche, but from McLaren, a British company that had spent decades building Formula One race cars, but had never built a road car. In 1992, they unveiled the F1, and it redefined what a supercar could be. The McLaren F1 had a top speed of 241 miles per hour, faster than any production car before it. It had a naturally aspirated V12 engine producing 627 horsepower. It weighed just 2,444 pounds, and it had a central driving position, with the driver seated in the middle of the car and two passenger seats flanking them slightly behind. It was the most extreme, most advanced, most expensive production car ever built, and it was absolutely magnificent. The story of the F1 begins with Gordon Murray. Murray was a South African engineer who had designed championship-winning Formula One cars for Brabham and McLaren. He understood aerodynamics, materials, and the physics of speed better than almost anyone alive. And in the late 1980s, he became obsessed with an idea. Could you build the perfect road car? Not the fastest, not the most powerful, but the best. A car with no compromises, no cost constraints, no marketing department dictating features, just pure engineering excellence. Murray convinced Ron Dennis, the head of McLaren, to fund the project. And in 1990, work began on what would become the F1. Murray's philosophy was simple. Make it light, make it powerful, make it focused. He was not interested in building a luxury car or a status symbol. He wanted to build the ultimate driver's car, something that would deliver an experience unlike anything else on the road. The chassis was a carbon fibre monocoque, the first time this material had been used in a road car. Carbon fibre had been used in Formula One for years because of its incredible strength-to-weight ratio. It was stronger than steel but weighed a fraction as much. The monocoque was formed from multiple layers of carbon fibre cloth, laid up by hand and cured in an autoclave under heat and pressure. The result was a structure that weighed just 200 pounds, but was strong enough to withstand enormous crash forces. Every other component was scrutinised for weight. The wheels were made of magnesium, the brake calipers were titanium. The exhaust system was built from titanium and Inconel, an exotic nickel alloy used in jet engines. Even the toolkit was custom-made from titanium. Murray was fanatical about weight reduction. He once rejected a stereo system because it was too heavy, telling the supplier to come back with something lighter. The engine was sourced from BMW. Murray wanted a naturally aspirated engine because turbocharged engines, while powerful, had lag and added complexity. He wanted immediate throttle response, linear power delivery, and high revving drama. BMW Motorsport built him a 6.1-litre V12 with 4 overhead camshafts, 48 valves, and individual throttle bodies for each cylinder. It produced 627 horsepower at 7,400 revolutions per minute and would rev to 7,500. And it weighed just 586 pounds, lighter than many V8 engines of the era. The engine was naturally aspirated, which meant it required precise tuning and exotic materials to produce that much power. The pistons were forged aluminum, the connecting rods were titanium, the valve train used lightweight materials throughout, and the intake system was a work of art, with 12 individual throttles feeding air directly to each cylinder. The sound was unlike anything else, a high-pitched wail that rose and fell with the throttle, mechanical and pure. The transmission was a 6-speed manual, developed specifically for the F1. It was mounted directly to the engine, forming a compact powertrain unit. The shifter was mounted high on the centre console, between the driver's knees, and required precise, deliberate movements. There was no option for an automatic transmission. This was a driver's car and it demanded engagement. The suspension was double wishbones at all 4 corners with coil springs and adjustable dampers. There were no electronic aids, no traction control, no stability control. Just raw mechanical grip and the driver's skill. Murray believed that electronic systems dulled the driving experience, that they created a barrier between the driver and the road. The F1 was designed to communicate everything, to let the driver feel exactly what the tyres were doing, exactly how much grip was available. But perhaps the most radical feature of the F1 was the driving position. Murray placed the driver's seat in the centre of the car, directly on the centre line. This gave perfect visibility and perfect weight distribution. The 2 passenger seats were set back and to the sides, slightly elevated, so passengers could see over the driver's shoulders. It was inspired by the cockpit of a fighter jet, and it fundamentally changed how you experienced the car. Getting into the F1 was theatrical. The doors were dihedral, hinged at the front and opening upward and forward. You stepped over a wide sill and lowered yourself into the carbon fibre seat, which was custom moulded to each owner's body. The steering wheel was small and leather-wrapped. The dashboard was simple, with analogue gauges and minimal switches. Everything was focused on driving. The body was designed by Peter Stevens, and it was purely functional. There were no decorative lines, no styling flourishes. Every surface served a purpose. The front had a low splitter and smooth surfaces to reduce drag. The sides had large air intakes to feed the engine and cool the brakes. The rear had a diffuser and a small retractable spoiler that deployed at speed to provide downforce, and the entire shape was optimised in a wind tunnel to minimise drag while maintaining stability. The F1 was unveiled to the public in Monaco in May of 1992, and the reaction was stunned silence followed by thunderous applause. Journalists and enthusiasts had never seen anything like it. This was not just another supercar. This was a complete reimagining of what a road car could be. Production began in 1994 at a purpose-built facility in Woking, England. Each car took 3 months to build. Every component was inspected. Every panel was hand-fitted. The total production run was limited to 106 cars, including racing versions. The price was just under $1 million, making it the most expensive production car in the world at the time. But the F1 delivered on every promise. In 1998, automotive journalist Andy Wallace took a lightly modified F1 to the Erlesian test track in Germany and recorded a top speed of 241 miles per hour. This was not a specially prepared car. It was a production vehicle with the rev limiter removed and the catalytic converters replaced with straight pipes, and it shattered the previous record by over 20 miles per hour. That record stood for over a decade. No other production car could match it until the Bugatti Veyron arrived in 2005, and even then the Veyron needed 4 turbochargers, 16 cylinders, and 1,000 horsepower to beat the naturally aspirated F1. Driving the F1 was an experience that transcended normal automotive boundaries. The visibility from the central driving position was extraordinary. The steering was precise and communicative. The engine responded instantly to throttle inputs, with no turbo lag, no hesitation. The sound was intoxicating, a rising scream that filled the cabin, and the acceleration was brutal. 0 to 60 miles per hour took 3.2 seconds. 0 to 100 took 6.3 seconds, and it just kept accelerating, pulling harder and harder as the revs climbed. But the F1 was not easy to drive fast. It required skill and concentration. The throttle response was immediate, which meant you could break traction at any speed if you were careless. The steering was quick, which made the car agile but also demanding. And the lack of electronic aids meant you had to manage everything yourself. Weight transfer, brake pressure, throttle application, all of it was your responsibility. The F1 also proved itself in competition. McLaren built 5 racing versions, called the F1 GTR, and entered them in international sports car racing. In 1995, an F1 GTR won the 24 Hours of Le Mans outright, beating purpose-built prototypes from established manufacturers. It was one of the greatest underdog victories in motorsport history. A road car, slightly modified, beating the best race cars in the world. Gordon Murray's vision had been vindicated. He had set out to build the ultimate driver's car, and he had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The F1 was not just fast. It was engaging, communicative, rewarding. It was a car that made you a better driver, simply by demanding more from you. The 1990s were a decade of rapid advancement. Computers transformed car design. Wind tunnels became standard tools. Materials science progressed, and the boundaries of performance kept expanding. But the F1 represented something more than technological progress. It represented a philosophy, the belief that less could be more, that lightness mattered more than power, that engagement mattered more than ease. As the decade came to a close, the automotive world was preparing for another transformation. Hybrid technology was emerging, emissions regulations were tightening, and the digital revolution was beginning to invade every aspect of the car, from the engine management to the entertainment system. The 2000s would bring faster cars, more powerful cars, more technologically advanced cars, but few would ever match the purity of the McLaren F1. The 2000s, the Bugatti Veyron. The 2000s were the years when the world realised that everything had changed. The terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 redefined global politics. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq dominated the news. The housing bubble inflated and then collapsed, triggering the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Social media emerged and transformed how people communicated. Smartphones put computers in everyone's pockets. And in the automotive world, engineers began to ask questions that seemed absurd just years earlier. What if we could build a car with 1,000 horsepower? What if we could exceed 250 miles per hour? What if money was no object? The answer was the Bugatti Veyron. Introduced in 2005 after years of development, it was the most ambitious production car ever attempted. It had a quad-turbocharged 8-litre W16 engine, producing 1,001 horsepower. It could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 2.5 seconds, and it had a top speed of 253 miles per hour, faster than any production car before it. It was absurd, excessive, and absolutely extraordinary. The story of the Veyron begins with Ferdinand Piëch. Piëch was the chairman of the Volkswagen Group, a man with an engineering background and an obsession with technical achievement. He had overseen the development of the Porsche 917 race car in the 1960s. He had pushed Audi to dominate rally racing with the Quattro. And in 1998, Volkswagen acquired the Bugatti name, a legendary French marque that had been dormant for decades. Piëch saw an opportunity. He would revive Bugatti by building the most extreme car imaginable. Not just fast, but the fastest. Not just powerful, but the most powerful. A car that would rewrite every record and redefine what was possible. And he was willing to spend whatever it took to make it happen. The project began in 1999. Piëch gave his engineers a set of specifications that seemed impossible. The car must have over 1,000 horsepower. It must exceed 400 kilometers per hour, or 248 miles per hour. It must accelerate from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour in under 3 seconds. And it must be comfortable, refined, and usable as a daily driver. Most engineers would have laughed at these requirements. Piëch's engineers got to work. The engine was the most radical component. Volkswagen already had a narrow-angle V8 engine called a W8, used in some of their luxury sedans. The engineers took 2 of these W8 configurations and joined them to create a W16. 16 cylinders arranged in 4 banks, each bank with 4 cylinders. The configuration was compact, allowing the massive engine to fit in a relatively small space. The displacement was 8 litres. But to reach 1,000 horsepower, the engineers knew they needed forced induction. They fitted 4 turbochargers, 1 for each bank of cylinders. The turbos were mounted low, close to the exhaust ports, to reduce lag. And the entire system was managed by sophisticated electronics that controlled boost pressure, fuel delivery, and ignition timing. The result was an engine that produced 1,001 horsepower at 6,000 revolutions per minute, and 922 pound-feet of torque at 2,200 revolutions per minute. It was the most powerful engine ever fitted to a production car, and it was remarkably smooth, with almost no vibration thanks to the counterbalance crankshaft and the even firing order of the W16 configuration. But producing that much power created enormous engineering challenges. The heat generated by the engine and turbos was immense. The Veyron required 10 radiators to keep everything cool. 3 for the engine coolant, 2 for the intercoolers, 1 for the transmission oil, 1 for the differential oil, 1 for the engine oil, and 2 for the air conditioning system. The cooling requirements were so extreme that if you blocked the air intakes at speed, the engine would overheat in minutes. The transmission was a 7-speed dual-clutch unit, developed specifically for the Veyron. Dual-clutch transmissions use 2 separate clutches, 1 for odd gears and 1 for even gears. This allows for incredibly fast shifts, because the next gear is already pre-selected. The Veyron could shift in 150 milliseconds, faster than any human could move their hand. The chassis was a carbon fibre monocoque, similar to the McLaren F1, but larger and heavier. The Veyron weighed 4,162 pounds, nearly twice as much as the F1, but the engineers had no choice. To handle 1,000 horsepower, to remain stable at 250 miles per hour, the car needed to be substantial. The suspension was double wishbones at all 4 corners, with adaptive dampers that adjusted stiffness based on driving conditions. The car had multiple driving modes, a comfort mode for normal driving, a sport mode for aggressive driving, and a top speed mode that lowered the car, adjusted the wing angle, and closed various air vents to reduce drag. The brakes were carbon ceramic discs, 16 inches in diameter at the front, 15 inches at the rear. They were clamped by 8 piston calipers. And even with this massive braking system, stopping the Veyron from top speed generated so much heat that the discs would glow red. The tyres were specially developed by Michelin. At 250 miles per hour, centrifugal force would try to tear regular tyres apart. Michelin had to develop a new compound and construction that could withstand the stress. Each tyre cost over $30,000 and had to be replaced after 2,500 miles, regardless of tread wear, because the adhesive that held the tyre together would begin to degrade. The body was designed by Hartmut Vorkus and styled by Josef Kaban at Volkswagen. It was distinctive but not beautiful in the classical sense. The front was dominated by a horseshoe grille, a Bugatti trademark dating back to the 1920s. The sides featured a prominent character line that divided the two-tone paint scheme, and the rear had a massive wing that deployed at speed to provide downforce and acted as an air brake during deceleration. Every surface was sculpted to manage airflow. The Veyron had one of the lowest drag coefficients of any production car, just 0.36, but it also generated significant downforce to keep the car stable at extreme speeds. The engineers spent thousands of hours in wind tunnels, refining every detail. The interior was luxurious, leather everywhere, aluminum accents, climate control, a premium sound system. The Veyron was not a stripped-out race car. It was a grand tourer, designed to cross continents in comfort, but it was also capable of obliterating speed records. The Veyron debuted at the Geneva Motor Show in March of 2005, though the project had been publicly announced years earlier. Development had been difficult, multiple prototypes were built and tested. Engineers struggled to make all the systems work together reliably, and there were rumours that Volkswagen would cancel the project because it was losing money on every car sold. But Piëch pushed forward, and in 2005, the production Veyron was finally ready. Automotive journalist James May took one to Volkswagen's Air-Alessien test track and recorded a top speed of 253.2 miles per hour. The McLaren F1's record had been broken. The Veyron was officially the fastest production car in the world. The price was $1.7 million, making it the most expensive new car you could buy at the time. But customers lined up. Bugatti planned to build 300, and they were all sold before production even began. The people who bought Veyrons were among the wealthiest in the world. Entrepreneurs, athletes, celebrities, royalty, and they drove them hard. Driving the Veyron was unlike anything else. At low speeds, it was docile, easy to manage, comfortable. The engine burbled quietly. The ride was smooth. You could use it to run errands if you wanted, though the visibility was poor and parking it was nerve-wracking. But when you opened the throttle, the Veyron transformed. The turbos spooled up, the engine roared, and the acceleration was incomprehensible. The horizon rushed toward you at a speed that made your brain struggle to process what was happening. 0 to 100 miles per hour took 5.5 seconds. 0 to 200 miles per hour took 22 seconds. And it just kept pulling, harder and harder, until you ran out of road or courage. The handling was surprisingly manageable, despite the weight and power. The all-wheel drive system distributed torque intelligently. The electronic stability control kept the car pointed where you aimed it. And the steering, while not particularly communicative, was precise and predictable. The Veyron was designed to be fast in a straight line, and it excelled at that. In 2010, Bugatti introduced the Veyron Supersport, an even more extreme version with 1,200 horsepower and a top speed of 267 miles per hour. It was a limited run of 30 cars, and it pushed the boundaries even further. The Veyron represented the ultimate expression of brute force engineering. It did not achieve speed through lightness or aerodynamic efficiency. It achieved speed through overwhelming power. It was the opposite of Gordon Murray's philosophy with the McLaren F1. Where the F1 was about purity and engagement, the Veyron was about technology and dominance. Critics argued that the Veyron was excessive, unnecessary, a monument to ego rather than engineering. They pointed out that Volkswagen lost money on every car, that it was a vanity project funded by Volkswagen's mass-market profits. And they were right, but they missed the point. The Veyron was never about profit. It was about proving what was possible. It was about pushing boundaries. It was about showing the world that if you had the will and the resources, you could achieve things that seemed impossible. It was Ferdinand Piëch's final gift to the automotive world, a car that existed purely because he demanded it. The 2000s were a decade of extremes: economic boom and economic collapse, technological progress and global conflict, and the Veyron fit perfectly into that context. It was a car that made no sense in a rational world. But the world has never been entirely rational, and sometimes the most important things are the ones that exist simply because they can. As the decade ended and the 2010s began, the automotive world was changing again. Electric vehicles were emerging as viable alternatives. Hybrid hypercars were combining electric motors with internal combustion engines to create even more power, and the pursuit of speed was continuing, faster than ever. The 2010s, the Koenigsegg Agera RS. The 2010s were the years when the world went mobile and the impossible became routine. Smartphones dominated daily life, social media connected billions of people, streaming services replaced cable television, electric cars, once dismissed as impractical, were suddenly viable. Tesla proved that battery-powered vehicles could be fast, desirable and profitable. And in the world of hypercars, a small Swedish manufacturer was proving that you did not need the resources of Volkswagen to build the fastest car on Earth. The Koenigsegg Agera RS, in its final form in 2017, achieved a verified top speed of 277.9 miles per hour on a closed section of Nevada highway. It was the fastest production car in the world. It had done it with a twin-turbocharged 5-litre V8, producing 1,160 horsepower. It weighed just 3,250 pounds, and it had been built by a company that employed fewer than 100 people in a former military airbase in rural Sweden. The story of Koenigsegg is the story of one man's obsession. Christian von Koenigsegg was 5 years old when he watched a Norwegian stop-motion film called Fluklipa Grand Prix, about a bicycle repairman who builds a race car. Young Christian decided that he too would build cars. Not just any cars, the fastest cars in the world. He founded Koenigsegg Automotive in 1994 when he was 22 years old. He had no engineering degree, no experience in the automotive industry, no factory, no money, just determination and a vision. He set up shop in an abandoned military hangar in Ängelholm, Sweden, and he started building prototypes. The first Koenigsegg, the CC, debuted in 1996. It was crude but showed promise. Over the next decade, Koenigsegg refined the design, built a small production run, and established a reputation for building extremely fast, extremely expensive cars for wealthy enthusiasts. But it was the Agera, introduced in 2010, that put Koenigsegg on the map. The name Agera comes from the Swedish verb meaning to act or to take action, and action was exactly what the car delivered. The Agera was designed to be faster, lighter, and more technologically advanced than anything Koenigsegg had built before. The engine was a 5-litre V8, designed in-house by Koenigsegg. It had dual overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder, and twin turbochargers. But what made it special was the engineering philosophy. Koenigsegg was obsessed with efficiency. Every component was designed to be as light and as strong as possible. The engine block was aluminum. The crankshaft was fully counterweighted to reduce vibration. The turbochargers were mounted high, integrated into the exhaust manifold to reduce plumbing and weight. In the Agera RS, the most powerful version, the engine produced 1,160 horsepower on regular gasoline. If you fed it E85 ethanol, a fuel with higher octane, the output jumped to 1,380 horsepower. This was more power than the Bugatti Veyron, from an engine that was 3 litres smaller and weighed hundreds of pounds less. The transmission was a 7-speed dual-clutch unit, but unlike most dual-clutch transmissions, it did not use a traditional gearbox housing. Instead, Koenigsegg developed what they called a direct drive system. In 6th and 7th gears, the clutch locked directly to the output shaft, eliminating the gear mesh and reducing friction losses. It was a brilliant piece of engineering that improved both acceleration and top speed. The chassis was a carbon fibre monocoque with aluminum honeycomb reinforcement. Carbon fibre was expensive and time-consuming to work with, but it was the only way to achieve the strength and lightness Koenigsegg demanded. The entire chassis weighed just 143 pounds, yet it was strong enough to pass all crash safety requirements. The body panels were also carbon fibre, and they were works of art. Every surface was functional. The front had active aerodynamics that adjusted flaps to direct airflow. The sides had large air intakes for the engine and brakes. The rear had an active wing that deployed at speed and could adjust its angle to optimise downforce or reduce drag. Even the wheels were carbon fibre, the first production car in the world to use this technology. Carbon fibre wheels were lighter than aluminum or magnesium, which reduced unsprung weight and improved handling. The suspension was double wishbones with active dampers that could adjust stiffness in milliseconds. The brakes were carbon ceramic discs with 6 piston calipers, and the tyres were specially developed by Michelin, just like the Veyrons, capable of withstanding the extreme speeds the Agera RS could achieve. The interior was surprisingly comfortable. Leather seats, digital displays, climate control. Unlike the Spartan interiors of earlier supercars, the Agera RS was designed to be usable. You could drive it across a continent if you wanted. Though with a fuel consumption of single-digit miles per gallon at full throttle, you would be stopping for gas frequently. But what truly set Koenigsegg apart was the innovation. Christian von Koenigsegg and his small team were not bound by corporate bureaucracy or conservative engineering traditions. They could experiment, take risks, try ideas that larger companies would never approve, and many of those ideas worked. The Agera RS featured what Koenigsegg called their autoskin system. Hydraulic actuators opened and closed the doors, the hood, and the engine cover at the touch of a button. No heavy mechanisms, no manual latches, just smooth automated movement. It was a small detail, but it exemplified Koenigsegg's approach. Use technology to solve problems elegantly. The Agera RS was unveiled in 2015 as the ultimate version of the Agera line. Koenigsegg planned to build just 25 examples, and in November of 2017, they decided to prove what the car could do. They closed a section of Nevada State Route 160, a long, straight highway outside Las Vegas. They brought in independent GPS and data logging equipment to verify speeds, and they put racing driver Nicholas Lilia behind the wheel. Over the course of several runs, the Agera RS set multiple records. The fastest speed achieved was 284.5 miles per hour on one run. The average of 2 runs in opposite directions required for official records was 277.9 miles per hour. The Bugatti Veyron Supersport's record was broken. Koenigsegg was officially the fastest, but the Agera RS also set other records that day. Fastest time from 0 to 400 km per hour and back to 0, 36.4 seconds. Fastest flying kilometre, just under 18 seconds at an average speed of 276 miles per hour. The Agera RS was not just fast in a straight line, it was fast everywhere. Videos of the runs went viral. Watching the Agera RS accelerate was mesmerising. The engine sound rose from a rumble to a scream. The desert landscape became a blur, and the car just kept pulling harder and harder until it seemed like the laws of physics would surely intervene. But they did not. The Agera RS was stable, controllable, breathtaking. Driving an Agera RS was described by journalists as one of the most intense experiences in the automotive world. The acceleration was violent. The steering was precise and communicative. The brakes were powerful enough to slow the car from absurd speeds without drama. And the engine, that magnificent twin-turbo V8, delivered power in a smooth, relentless surge that made you feel like you were riding a controlled explosion. But the Agera RS was not easy. It had no traction control, no stability control, at least not in the traditional sense. Koenigsegg believed in giving the driver control, not letting computers make decisions. The car would tell you what it was doing through the steering, the throttle, the sounds and vibrations, but it expected you to respond appropriately. Drive it with respect, and it was manageable. Drive it carelessly, and it would punish you. The 20s were a decade of rapid change in the automotive world. Emissions regulations became stricter. Manufacturers began investing heavily in electric and hybrid technology. Autonomous driving features started appearing in mainstream cars. And the internal combustion engine, which had powered automobiles for over a century, suddenly seemed like it might have an expiration date. But companies like Koenigsegg proved that the internal combustion engine still had life in it, that with clever engineering, advanced materials, and relentless optimization, you could build cars that were faster and more efficient than ever before. The Agera RS was a celebration of what the internal combustion engine could achieve when pushed to its absolute limit. Christian von Koenigsegg had achieved his childhood dream. He had built the fastest car in the world, and he had done it on his own terms, without compromising his vision, without answering to corporate overlords. The Agera RS was proof that small companies with big ideas could still compete with automotive giants. As the decade came to a close, the automotive world was preparing for another transformation. Electric hypercars were coming, combining instant torque from electric motors with the drama of internal combustion engines. The 2020s would bring cars with over 2,000 horsepower, cars that could accelerate faster than the human body could comfortably tolerate. But the Agera RS represented the peak of what a traditional supercar could be. Lightweight, powerful, mechanical, pure. And as the world moved toward electrification, toward automation, toward a future where cars drove themselves, the Agera RS stood as a reminder of what had been. A time when speed required courage, when driving required skill, when the fastest car in the world was built not by an enormous corporation, but by a small team of dedicated engineers in a former military hangar in Sweden. The 20s are the years when the world learned to live with constant disruption. The COVID-19 pandemic shut down entire economies and killed millions. Remote work became normal. Supply chains collapsed and rebuilt. Cryptocurrency surged and crashed. Artificial intelligence advanced at a breathtaking pace. And in the automotive world, the transition to electric power accelerated faster than anyone had predicted. Traditional manufacturers announced plans to phase out internal combustion engines entirely. Startups promised electric hypercars with 2,000 horsepower and 0 to 60 times under 2 seconds. And yet, in Texas, a small company called Hennessey Performance was building something defiant. A car with a twin-turbocharged V8 engine. No electric motors, no hybrid assistance, just raw combustion-powered speed. The Hennessey Venom F5, in its final specification, achieved a verified top speed of 271.6 miles per hour in 2024. While not quite as fast as the Koenigsegg Agera RS, it represented something important. It was proof that the internal combustion engine was not finished. That there was still room for innovation, still potential for speed, still magic in the sound of a naturally breathing engine pushed to its limits. The story of the Venom F5 begins with John Hennessey. Hennessey started his career in the 1990s, tuning and modifying performance cars in a small shop in Texas. He specialized in extracting absurd amounts of power from American V8s, particularly the Dodge Viper. He built twin-turbo Vipers that produced over 1,000 horsepower when most supercars were making half that. And he built a reputation for going further than anyone else thought possible or practical. In 2010, Hennessey built his first complete car, the Venom GT, based on a modified Lotus Exige chassis. It was crude but effective, setting a top speed record of 270.4 miles per hour in 2014. But Hennessey wanted more. He wanted to build a car from the ground up, not based on someone else's platform. A car that could challenge the Bugatti Veyron and the Koenigsegg Agera. A car that would be the ultimate expression of American horsepower. Work on the Venom F5 began in 2014. The name came from the Fujita scale, used to measure tornado intensity. F5 is the highest rating, winds over 200 miles per hour, total devastation. It was an appropriate name for what Hennessey was planning. The engine was the heart of the project. Hennessey called it Fury, and it was a 6.6-litre twin-turbocharged V8 designed entirely in-house. Most hypercar manufacturers sourced engines from established suppliers or adapted racing engines. Hennessey built his from scratch. The block was aluminum. The heads were billet machined. The crankshaft was forged steel. The connecting rods were titanium, and the pistons were forged aluminum. It was a clean sheet design, optimized for one thing: maximum power with acceptable reliability. The twin turbochargers were mounted low, integrated into the exhaust manifolds to reduce lag. The engine management system was custom developed, controlling fuel injection, ignition timing, and boost pressure with millisecond precision. And the output was staggering: 1,817 horsepower at 8,000 revolutions per minute, 1,193 pound-feet of torque at 5,500 revolutions per minute. This was more power than the original Bugatti Veyron from an engine that was nearly 2 litres smaller. But power alone was not enough. The car had to be light. Hennessey targeted a weight of just 3,000 pounds, less than many sports cars, let alone hypercars. To achieve this, the chassis was a carbon fibre monocoque with integrated roll cage. The body panels were carbon fibre. The wheels were carbon fibre. Even the seats were carbon fibre, moulded to the owner's body. Every component was scrutinised. If it did not need to be there, it was removed. The suspension was double wishbones with adjustable dampers. The brakes were massive carbon ceramic discs with 6-piston calipers. The tyres were specially developed by Michelin, using the lessons learned from the Veyron and the Agera RS programs. At 270 miles per hour, tyre technology was just as critical as engine technology. The transmission was a 7-speed, single-clutch automated manual. Hennessey chose this over a dual-clutch design because it was lighter and simpler. Shifts were not as fast as a dual-clutch, but they were fast enough. And in a car focused on top speed, raw acceleration from rest was less important than maintaining momentum at triple-digit speeds. The aerodynamics were developed in collaboration with Delta Wing, a company known for innovative race car design. The Venom F5 needed to be slippery with minimal drag, but it also needed to remain stable at extreme speeds. The body featured active aerodynamics, with flaps and vanes that adjusted based on speed and driving conditions. At low speeds, they maximised downforce for cornering. At high speeds, they retracted to minimise drag. The design was the work of Hennessey's in-house team, led by John Hennessey himself. It was aggressive and purposeful. The front was low and wide with a splitter that skimmed the ground. The sides featured large intakes and smooth surfaces. The rear had a massive diffuser and a fixed wing. It looked fast standing still. The interior was surprisingly luxurious for a car focused on speed. Leather and Alcantara everywhere. Digital displays, climate control, a premium sound system. Hennessey wanted the Venom F5 to be usable, not just a track weapon. You could drive it on the street, take it on road trips, use it the way you would any exotic car. Though with single-digit fuel economy at full throttle, those road trips would involve frequent fuel stops. The Venom F5 was unveiled in 2017, but development continued for years. Building a hypercar from scratch was enormously challenging, especially for a small company. Hennessey faced delays, technical problems, and skepticism from critics who doubted that a Texas tuning shop could compete with established manufacturers. But Hennessey persevered. Production finally began in 2021. Each car took months to build. Only 24 would be made, a number chosen to honour the 24 hours of Le Mans. The price was $2.1 million, making it one of the most expensive new cars in the world. But Hennessey still had to prove the performance claims. In 2024, he brought a Venom F5 to the Johnny Bomer Proving Grounds at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The facility had a 3.2-mile runway, perfect for top-speed testing. With professional driver David Donahue at the wheel and GPS verification equipment recording every moment, the Venom F5 achieved a top speed of 271.6 miles per hour. It was not the fastest ever, but it was close. And it was entirely combustion-powered, with no electric assistance. Driving the Venom F5 was described as overwhelming. The acceleration was brutal, pressing you back into the seat with unrelenting force. The engine sound was magnificent, a rising howl that filled the cabin and made conversation impossible. The steering was precise but heavy, demanding strength and focus. And the speed, the sheer velocity, was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. But what made the Venom F5 special was not just the numbers, it was what it represented. By the 20s, most high-performance manufacturers were embracing electrification. The Rimac Nevera, a fully electric hypercar, could accelerate faster than almost anything else on Earth. The Porsche 918 Spider used a hybrid powertrain. Even Ferrari and McLaren were building plug-in hybrids. The internal combustion engine was being phased out, replaced by electric motors that delivered instant torque and zero emissions. The Venom F5 was a rejection of that trend. It was a statement that the internal combustion engine still had value, still had appeal, still delivered an experience that electric motors could not replicate. The sound, the vibration, the connection between throttle input and mechanical response. These things mattered to enthusiasts, even if they were becoming increasingly rare. The 20s are still unfolding as of this recording, but certain trends are clear. Electric vehicles are becoming mainstream. Autonomous driving technology is improving. Regulations on emissions and safety are tightening. And the automotive landscape is changing faster than it has in decades. Traditional manufacturers are struggling to adapt. Startups are disrupting established markets. And the definition of performance is being rewritten. But cars like the Venom F5 prove that there is still a place for the old ways. For naturally aspirated and turbocharged engines. For manual transmissions and mechanical connections. For the drama and emotion of combustion. These cars may become rarer as the years pass. They may eventually become museum pieces, relics of a different era. But for now, they continue to be built, and they continue to inspire. John Hennessey built the Venom F5 because he believed in the internal combustion engine. Because he believed that speed was about more than just numbers on a data sheet. It was about experience, about emotion, about the connection between human and machine. And the Venom F5 delivered that experience in the purest, most unfiltered way possible. As we look toward the future, the automotive world is at a crossroads. Electric hypercars are achieving performance that would have seemed impossible just years ago. The Rimac Nevera can accelerate from 0 to 60 in 1.85 seconds. The Lotus Evija promises 2,000 horsepower from 4 electric motors. And Bugatti has announced the Tourbillon, a hybrid hypercar with a naturally aspirated V16 engine combined with electric motors for a total output of over 1,700 horsepower. The pursuit of speed continues. But the methods are changing, the technology is evolving, and the cars themselves are becoming more sophisticated, more capable, and in some ways more distant from the driver. Electronic systems manage everything. Computers make thousands of decisions per second, and the raw mechanical connection that defined driving for over a century is slowly disappearing. But for those who remember, for those who experienced the age of combustion, cars like the Venom F5 are a reminder. A reminder of what it felt like to drive something truly analog. Something that demanded your full attention and rewarded your skill. Something that roared and vibrated and made you feel alive. The century of velocity is not over. Speed will always be pursued. Records will continue to fall. But as we move into an electric future, we carry with us the legacy of everything that came before. From the Mercedes 35 HP, with its revolutionary 53 mph top speed, to the Hennessey Venom F5, pushing past 270 mph, each car represented the absolute limit of what was possible in its time. And that pursuit, that relentless drive to go faster, to push harder, to break boundaries, is fundamentally human. It is not about the destination. It has never been about the destination. It is about the journey, the acceleration, the sound of an engine at full cry, the feeling of speed pressing you back into your seat, the knowledge that you are experiencing something extraordinary, something that exists at the very edge of what technology and courage can achieve. From 1900 to today, we have witnessed over a century of speed. From 53 mph to 271. From carriage-like contraptions to carbon fibre rockets. The pursuit of velocity has driven innovation, pushed boundaries, and created some of the most magnificent machines ever built. If you enjoyed this deep dive through automotive history, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below and tell us what topic we should explore next. The history of motorsport, the evolution of engine technology, or perhaps something entirely different. Thank you for listening. Until next time, keep chasing speed.